There are states that grew, fell, and disappeared. There are empires that for a moment seemed eternal and then crumbled into dust. But the history of China is different. It is not a story of one kingdom, one dynasty, or one nation in the simple modern sense. Rather, it is the history of a civilization that has repeatedly broken, divided, burned, and rebuilt, yet every time returned to the same grand idea that under heaven there can exist order, a center, and a state that has the moral right to rule a vast world. When we look at the history of China, we do not see one single straight line. We see thousands of years of constant struggle for unity, power, memory, and survival. Before the first emperors appeared, before the walls, palaces, and monumental tombs were erected, numerous Neolithic cultures developed on the lands of today's China. In the valley of the Huanghe, the Yellow River, and along the Yangtze, people cultivated millet and rice, built settlements, created pottery, and gradually moved from a world of clans to increasingly complex social structures. It was not one single source from which a state suddenly emerged. Rather, it was a mosaic of cultures that for centuries mixed, rivaled, and passed on technologies, rituals, and models of power. In Chinese tradition, the first dynasty was the Xia, but its existence still remains partly in the realm of tradition and interpretation, because archaeology has not yet given us evidence as unambiguous as in the case of later eras. This is important because Chinese history begins not only with facts, but also with the memory of how civilization itself wanted to tell the story of its beginning. The first dynasty that we can grasp much more certainly was the Shang. It is during its time that clear traces of developed royal power, ritual sacrifices, bronze weapons, and the famous oracle bones with inscriptions appear, which belong to the oldest known forms of Chinese writing. Even then, something is visible that will later become the axis of Chinese civilization, a close connection between politics, religion, and memory. The ruler was not merely an administrator or a chieftain. He was an intermediary between the world of humans and the ancestors, and the state itself had a cosmic dimension. This is why the later history of China will so often revolve around the question not only of who has the power to rule, but also who has the moral right to do so. After the Shang dynasty came the Zhao dynasty, and with it one of the most important ideas in Chinese history, the mandate of heaven. According to this concept, the ruler did not reign because he was simply the strongest, but because heaven allowed him to maintain order. If he became a tyrant, if the country descended into chaos, famine, and rebellion, it meant that the mandate had been lost and a new dynasty could take it over. It was a brilliant political mechanism. It allowed for the overthrow of the previous authority, while simultaneously providing moral legitimacy to the new one. In practice, the Zhao dynasty built a system based on a network of feudal dependencies, but over time, central control began to weaken, and it was then that China entered an era that was both a time of chaos and an unprecedented intellectual explosion. The Spring and Autumn period, followed by the Warring States period, was an era of fragmentation, intrigue, war, and violent rivalry between states. But it was also the moment when great Chinese political and moral philosophy was born. It was then that Confucius, Laozi, Mozi, and thinkers associated with legalism lived. It was then that questions emerged that would return for 2,000 years. Should the state rule through moral example or through strict law? Does order come from virtue, ritual, and education, or from discipline and fear? How to build a stable world amidst endless violence? This is precisely the paradox of Chinese history. One of the world's greatest civilizations developed its ideas of order during a time of nearly permanent war. Out of this chaos emerged the state of Qin. Its ruler, Zhang, in the year 221 before the Common Era, achieved what no one before him could. He unified the rival kingdoms and proclaimed himself the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. This was a turning point. An empire was born that for the first time brought vast territories under a single center of power. The emperor and his advisors implemented ruthless reforms. The writing system, measures, weights, and wagon axle widths were standardized, while the administration was strengthened and local elites were subordinated to the state. In this way, a model was created that would last much longer than the Qin dynasty itself. For Qin was powerful, but short-lived. Governance based on brutal legalism, forced labor, and central control led to immense achievements, but also to hatred and rebellion. Nevertheless, the very idea of Imperial China survived. This is precisely what is key. The dynasty fell quickly, but the form of the state it created proved to be remarkably enduring. After the brief and violent episode of the Qin, the Han Dynasty emerged, one of the most important and influential in all of Chinese history. It was under the Han that the empire not only consolidated, but also learned to live longer than a single generation of conquests. The Han combined a strong state with a more flexible ideological approach. Legalist discipline did not disappear, but was cloaked in the Confucian language of morality, duty, and harmony. It was then that the model of the Chinese scholar official was born, a state based on bureaucracy, archives, administration, and the conviction that civilization endures through writing, ritual, and order. Under the Han Dynasty, contacts with Central Asia were developed, trade routes were opened that would later be named the Silk Road, and borders were strengthened against steppe peoples, especially the Xiongnu. During this time, China began to see itself not just as a large state, but as the center of the civilized world. But even the Han was not eternal. Toward the end of the dynasty, social tensions, financial crises, and the struggle between eunuchs, the court, and military commanders weakened the center. As the empire began to crumble, China once again entered one of its most memorable periods, the era of the Three Kingdoms. This was an epoch that, in later culture, became almost legendary. In reality, it was a time of brutal rivalry, fragmentation, and uncertainty. And yet, it was precisely then that an extraordinary feature of Chinese history became visible once more. Fragmentation did not mean the end of civilization. The state was breaking apart, but the memory of unity remained. No one considered chaos to be a natural state. Division was seen as something temporary, even though it could last for decades or even centuries. After the Three Kingdoms, there came further stages of division, migration, and rivalry between the North and the South. During this period, Buddhism began to play an important role, arriving in China from India and gradually taking root in the local culture. This is also an interesting moment because it shows that Chinese civilization was not closed off. It was capable of absorbing ideas from the outside, processing them, and giving them its own form. Buddhism in China did not simply remain an imported religion. Over time, it became part of the local spiritual landscape, influencing philosophy, art, monasteries, and intellectual life. Reunification came with the Sui dynasty at the end of the 6th century. The Sui lasted for a short time, but like the Qin, it played a role larger than its length of existence would suggest. It was during its reign that the construction of the Grand Canal began, one of the most important infrastructure projects in Chinese history, which connected the North and the South, facilitating the transport of grain, people, and troops. Again, we see the same pattern. After a long period of fragmentation, a dynasty emerges that brutally restores unity, creating the foundation for a more stable order. This time, that order was the Tang Dynasty. For many historians, the Tang represents one of the golden ages of China. The capital, Chang'an, was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Goods, religions, ideas, and people from Persia, Central Asia, India, and beyond flowed through the empire. Poetry, painting, administration, law, and art reached a high level. The state was strong, but also open to external contacts. It was then that China truly began to radiate as a center of civilization across the whole of East Asia. At the same time, beneath the beautiful surface of the Tang, tensions were brewing. The expansion of power among regional military commanders and crises at the court led in the 8th century to the catastrophic Han Lushan rebellion, which shook the empire and weakened it for many years. This is another recurring theme in Chinese history. Even the most brilliant dynasty can be wounded from within. After the Tang, a period of division followed once more, but China was reunited again, this time under the Song dynasty. And here the story becomes particularly interesting, because the Song was not always the most powerful militarily, but in many respects it was one of the most economically and technologically advanced civilizations of its time. Trade, urban markets, printing, the use of gunpowder, the compass, and paper money were all flourishing. The Song state was more civil than military, more bureaucratic than expansive, but at the same time incredibly productive. Many scholars see in the Song era a kind of early economic revolution. China was becoming wealthy, densely populated, and highly organized. And yet this subtle, developed civilization had to face brutal external pressure. In the north and west, the powers of non-Chinese peoples were growing: the Liao, the Xia, and later the Qin dynasty. The Song lost its northern territories and was eventually pushed to the south. This is important because it shows that Chinese history was not a simple story of uninterrupted dominance. Many times, the imperial center had to yield to steppe forces or northern empires, and then came the Mongols. Their expansion changed the course of history for almost all of Eurasia, and for China, it meant one of the deepest transformations in history. Genghis Khan began the conquests, but it was his successors, and especially Kublai Khan, who brought about the final subjugation of all of China. In the year 1271, Kublai proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, and a few years later, the last defense of the Song dynasty fell. For the first time, all of China found itself under the rule of a Mongol dynasty. This was no ordinary invasion. It was an attempt to rule one of the world's most complex civilizational organisms by an elite originating from the steppe. The Mongols maintained many of their own privileges and ethnic hierarchies, while simultaneously utilizing Chinese institutions and administrative resources. The Yuan era was a time of intense contact between China and the wider Eurasian world. It was during this period that travelers and merchants from the West arrived in China, and the empire became part of a broader Mongol order. However, Yuan rule was not stable forever. Crises, rebellions, natural disasters, and weakening legitimacy led to their fall in the 14th century. From the ruins of the Yuan, the Ming dynasty emerged, and once again Chinese history shows its characteristic rhythm. A foreign dynasty is overthrown, and the new power presents itself as a renewal of the legitimate order. The Ming rebuilt the imperial state in a more classically Chinese form, strengthening the bureaucracy, agriculture, and the power of the court. It is with the Ming era that we associate the Forbidden City in Beijing, as well as the great voyages of Admiral Zheng He, who at the beginning of the 15th century led massive fleets across the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. These voyages still fascinate today because they show that China had the potential to play an even greater maritime role in the world. And yet later, the state focused more on internal stability than on oceanic expansion. The Ming was also a time of great artisanal production, the development of trade, and the growing role of silver in the economy. But it was also a period in which old problems returned: corruption, fiscal tensions, peasant rebellion, and pressure from the north. In the 17th century, the Ming Dynasty fell, and power passed into the hands of the Manchus, who founded the Qing Dynasty. This was another moment that could have ended the history of Imperial China, but instead, it became a new chapter. The Qing were conquerors from the outside, but they very quickly showed that they could not only conquer China, but also rule it. They took over imperial institutions, presented themselves as legitimate rulers, and built one of the largest and most extensive empires in the history of Asia. It was under the Qing that the state territory encompassed not only the core of Old China, but also vast border regions such as Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. In the 18th century, especially during the reigns of Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, the Qing Empire appeared powerful, wealthy, and stable. For many inhabitants, it was a world that gave the impression of being permanent and orderly. And yet, it was precisely then that clouds began to gather, which would strike with full force in the 19th century. The problem did not lie in just one event, but in the collision of the old empire with a new, industrial, and aggressive global reality. The Opium Wars, unequal treaties, loss of control over parts of foreign trade, as well as massive internal crises like the Taiping Rebellion, weakened the Qing dramatically. This was one of the most painful periods in Chinese history, because the empire not only suffered from defeats and rebellions, but also had to face the feeling that the old world model was no longer working. A state that for centuries had perceived itself as the center of civilization suddenly faced the technological and military superiority of other powers. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, a question matured ever more clearly in China: how to save a country that is so old and at the same time so helpless against the modern world. Reforms came too late or were too limited. In 1911, the Qing Dynasty fell, and with it, the era of emperors ended. This was one of the greatest turning points in Chinese history. For over 2,000 years, the imperial form of the state had been the center of the political imaginary. Suddenly, it ceased to exist. A republic was established, but it did not bring immediate stability. On the contrary, the country plunged into an era of warlords, regional armies, a weak center, and an uncertain future. The 20th century was an exceptionally brutal time for China. First, Republican instability, then growing Japanese pressure, the invasion and terrible destruction of the Sino-Japanese War, followed by a continuing civil war. This was a moment when the ancient Chinese narrative of a civilizational center seemed almost shattered. And yet, once again, the history of China followed an old, though modern, pattern. Out of the chaos emerged a new power that promised unity, reconstruction, and a new order. In 1949, the founding of the People's Republic of China was announced. For some, it was a moment of revolutionary liberation. For others, the beginning of another very difficult period. The first decades of the new state brought deep social transformations, collectivization, political campaigns, and economic experiments, some of which had tragic consequences. The Great Leap Forward led to economic disaster and a famine. The Cultural Revolution struck institutions, culture, education, and society itself. This is an important part of China's history because it shows that the country's modern unity was not achieved without immense costs. After the death of Mao Zedong, another turning point occurred. From the late 70s, China entered a path of reform and economic opening. And once again, the world saw something familiar in a new form: a state of immense scale, a strong center, and a deep historical memory began to transform itself with incredible speed. In a matter of a few decades, China has become one of the most important economic centers of the world. Cities grew at a pace difficult to imagine. Infrastructure expanded. Hundreds of millions of people changed their lives, and the state regained a sense of strength and continuity. Of course, modern China is not simply an ancient empire in a new package. But it is impossible to understand it without this long history, in which the concepts of order, the center, bureaucracy, the state, and civilization have much deeper roots than in many other countries. And that is precisely what makes China's history so fascinating. It is not just a history of dynasties, battles, and maps. It is the story of a civilization that for thousands of years has preserved an astonishing ability to recreate itself. In Europe, the fall of an empire often meant the collapse of the world and the birth of something entirely new. In China, the fall of a dynasty usually meant something else. A catastrophe, yes, but a catastrophe after which attempts were made to rebuild unity once again. Not always immediately, not without pain, not without blood. But it is precisely this recurring movement from chaos to order that is perhaps the most important key to the entire history of China. So when we talk about 4,000 years of China, we are not just talking about the past of a single state. We are talking about one of the most enduring civilizational experiments in human history. About a world that created its own philosophies, bureaucracy, the ideal of a ruler, an examination system, great cities, monumental structures, and a historical memory so strong that even after the deepest crises, it could return to the same question: who has the right to rule under heaven, and how to maintain order in such a vast country? And perhaps that is why the history of China does not feel like a closed book. Rather, it resembles a river, sometimes calm, sometimes destroying everything in its path, but flowing onward for thousands of years, carrying with it the memory of all the ancient empires that still somehow live on in the present.